welcome to VVork. This is the continuation of a video series in which we're discussing containers, Docker, Kubernetes, PKS, and more with Marc Alumbaugh. In this video, Marc will discuss why and when Kubernetes by itself isn't enough. Let's get started.
This is where we transition over to is you're still going to have your physical and your virtual infrastructure down here. I think we all know we need a container runtime to be able to run our containers. That's where the industry is going. Kubernetes up here is going to handle some of that application scheduling and orchestration and deployment and scaling. How are you going to handle persistency of your data? You're going to hear everyone talking about, when we're talking about containers and microservices, everyone keeps saying stateless. It's a stateless application. It's a stateless application. Okay, let me go ahead and burst everyone's bubble. There's no such thing as a stateless application. You're just kicking the can down the road. Maybe the front part of your application, 80% of it's stateless, but the back end now, because it's microservices, we could clearly see where my stateful is going to be running at. Well, the stateful, this is something you're going to have to handle. How are you going to map through your data into the container? We call that persistency. Okay. Again, your typical workload is going to be probably 75, 70, 80% of it's going to be stateless, which means if there's a problem, just kill the container, restart the container, and it just restarts back up. You didn't lose anything. The persistency is where we're storing the actual transaction, the customer record, or the transaction that occurred. How are you going to handle that when you deploy something like Kubernetes? How are you going to handle the networking? Are you going to put all your containers on one layer 2 segment, or do you want to separate your networking out for different containers? How are you going to handle networking? How are you going to handle authentication? Who's allowed to maybe muck around with a Kubernetes cluster? How are you going to handle things like, which containers do you want allowed deployed? What happens if your container has bad stuff inside of it? How are you going to handle things like virus scanning of a base container before it goes out? Maybe vulnerability management of that container. Yes, I see, you want to deploy this container, developers. However, the base image of this container has 20 known CVEs and 4 of them are critical. No, I'm not going to let you deploy that in my enterprise. All of these aspects that I'm starting to talk through, like how are you going to manage the health of the Kubernetes cluster, not your vSphere cluster, but your Kubernetes cluster? Do your worker nodes have enough CPU? How am I going to upgrade those worker nodes? Yes, I could manually do it, but I'd really like an automated way to be able to handle upgrading my Kubernetes clusters. What are you going to do for general overall logging or analytics? If I want to look to see where's my latency between each of those microservices, do I need more of a particular microservice? Is one microservice turning into my bottleneck? Do I need to scale it larger? Right? How am I going to handle security across that whole aspect? And security is more than just networking. You heard me talk about, the image and the runtime. All of those are going to come into play. At the very top of this, you're going to be implementing some type of constant integration, constant deployment automation on top. Typically, people will do like a Jenkins a GitHub, something on the top to automate feeding this. Your life cycle or your deployment cycle is not going to turn into 2 versions of software being released a year. This is going to give you the ability to, do a new release maybe once a week, maybe even once a day. Think, your Apple iPhone with the App Store. So things are going to happen a whole lot quicker. All of these pieces inside here come into play as to questions you've got to answer. Your Kubernetes and containers, well, your Kubernetes and your containers is this one yellow box here in the middle. It's this box inside here. That's where the Kubernetes by itself is fixing or doing something. These other things that you saw me talking about in the blue area around, this is where our solution, our PKS solution, would help you by giving you enterprise-ready solutions to do things like image registry, to do networking, to handle persistence data in your deployment and your rollout of containers.
And that's, if I'm not mistaken, what we're going to be talking about in the next video is how PKS fits all into this overall application stack.
That's correct. That's what we're going to show you, is how these things all map into and where PKS kind of plugs into the solution.
In the next video, Marc will discuss building your own Kubernetes environment from scratch versus deploying VMware PKS. Join us in the next video to learn more.